Welcome to our deep dive into Indian society during the 18th century. This was a fascinating transitional period in Indian history, sitting right between the decline of the mighty Mughal Empire and the firm establishment of British colonial rule. Today, we are going to explore the economic conditions, the social fabric, and the cultural landscape of this era in detail. In the 18th century, India was fundamentally a land of stark contrasts. On one hand, you had rich and powerful nobles steeped in unimaginable luxury. On the other hand, the vast majority of the population, the peasants, lived at a bare subsistence level, facing constant oppression and injustice. The society as a whole failed to progress at an adequate pace. However, it is crucial to note that despite these severe disparities, historical records suggest the overall condition of the Indian masses was actually better at this time than it would be at the end of the 19th century, after over 100 years of British colonial extraction. Let's look at the economic engine of the time, agriculture. Interestingly, there was no shortage of land for farming in the 18th century, yet agriculture suffered deeply. Why? First, the methods were technologically backward and completely stagnant. Second, the peasants were squeezed dry. The state, local zamindars, and revenue farmers extracted the maximum possible amount from them. The peasants supported the entire society, but their own reward was miserably inadequate. Because of this, Indian villages turned inward, becoming largely self-sufficient and importing very little from the outside world. It might surprise you to learn just how dominant India was in global commerce at the start of the 18th century. Building on the extensive trade networks established under the Mughals, India traded heavily within its own borders and across Asia and Europe. Historians estimate that at the dawn of the century, India accounted for a staggering 23% of the entire world's economy. But this massive trade network began to suffer due to several crippling factors. Communication and transport were backward, making the movement of goods slow and expensive. The collapse of central authority led to constant warfare among regional rulers and a breakdown in law and order, meaning traders were frequently looted by organized robbers. Furthermore, every local chief demanded high customs duties as goods passed through their territory. The traditional consumers of luxury goods, the nobles, were becoming impoverished, killing demand. Finally, devastating political plunders by invaders like Nadir Shah and Ahmad Shah Abdali, as well as regional powers, sacked major industrial cities. However, the economic picture wasn't entirely bleak everywhere. The economy was shifting rather than just collapsing. In some coastal and regional pockets, trade actually expanded, driven by the activities and capital of European trading companies. We also see the emergence of new, vibrant cities like Faizabad, Lucknow, Varanasi, and Patna. In these new hubs, local nobility and wealthy zamindars provided fresh patronage, which helped artisanal production recover to a significant extent. During this era, India was famously known as a sink of precious metals. Because the Indian economy was so self-sufficient in both agricultural goods and high-quality handicrafts, it simply didn't need to buy much from the rest of the world. Conversely, the rest of the world desperately wanted Indian products. Because India exported far more than it imported, foreign merchants had to pay the difference in hard currency. This resulted in a continuous, massive influx of gold and silver into the Indian subcontinent. While India didn't import manufactured goods on a massive scale, it did have a highly diverse import network for specific regional specialties. From the Persian Gulf, India brought in pearls and dates. Arabia supplied coffee and gold. From China came tea and fine porcelain. Tibet provided musk and gold, while Singapore and Indonesia supplied tin, spices, and perfumes. Africa sent ivory, and from Europe, India imported specific metals like copper and lead, as well as paper and woolen cloth. On the export side, India was an absolute powerhouse. The country shipped out raw silk, indigo, saltpeter, which was vital for gunpowder, spices, and precious stones. But the crown jewel of Indian exports was its cotton textiles. Indian cotton was world famous for its incredible quality and was in high demand quite literally everywhere on the globe. It is also worth noting that during the 18th century, while maritime sea trade expanded rapidly, traditional overland trade routes through Afghanistan and Persia were severely disrupted by political instability. Before the Industrial Revolution took hold in the West, India was one of the leading centers of world industry. It was a land of extensive manufactures. We often think of manufacturing as a modern concept, but 18th century India was producing cotton, silk, sugar, jute, and metallic products like arms and metalwares on a massive scale. Indian artisans enjoyed worldwide fame for their unmatched skill and craftsmanship. One of the most impressive industrial sectors was shipbuilding, which flourished along the coasts of Maharashtra, Andhra, and Bengal. The quality of these vessels was so high that European companies frequently bought Indian-made ships for their own fleets. In fact, an English observer at the time admitted that when it came to the shipbuilding industry, Indians probably taught the English far more than they learned from them. The textile industry was vast and highly decentralized, with specialized hubs across the subcontinent. In Bengal, Dhaka and Murshidabad were legendary for fine fabrics. Gujarat had Surat and Ahmedabad. In the north and central regions, cities like Varanasi, Agra, and Lahore were massive production centers. The south boasted hubs like Masulipatanam, Bangalore, and Madrad. Meanwhile, up in the north, Kashmir was the undisputed center for high-quality woolen manufactures. So, to summarize the economic condition, the Indian economy was quite resilient, and daily economic life maintained a certain continuity. However, the overarching trend was one of decline due to political fragmentation. But we must keep this in perspective. Historians note that the economic distress and the decline in agricultural and handicraft production during this period were still far less severe than the systematic devastation that would later result from the full impact of British colonialism. Moving away from the economy, let's examine the social and cultural life of 18th century India. Generally speaking, this sphere was marked by stagnation and a heavy reliance on past traditions rather than innovation. It was a highly fragmented society. The people were deeply divided by religion, region, tribe, language, and perhaps most rigidly by caste. Among Hindus, the caste or jati system was the primary element of social disintegration. Beyond the broad four varnas, society was splintered into countless subcastes. The rules were incredibly rigid, permanently fixing a person's place in society from birth. Strict bans were placed on intercaste marriages and interdining. In many cases, higher castes would refuse food touched by lower castes, and caste often dictated one's profession. These oppressive regulations weren't just customs, they were strictly enforced by caste councils and panchayats through fines, penances, and the ultimate threat of expulsion from the community. Social backwardness was not limited to Hindus. Even though Islam fundamentally promotes social equality, Indian Muslims in the 18th century were deeply divided by caste, race, tribe, and status. At the top, nobles were fractured by religious differences between Shia and Sunni factions, as well as ethnic rivalries among Irani, Afghan, Turani, and Hindustani groups. Furthermore, there was a stark class divide. The Sharif Muslims, the nobles, scholars, and army officers, tended to look down on the lower-class Ajlaf Muslims in a manner strikingly similar to how higher-caste Hindus treated lower-caste Hindus. Despite these internal social divisions, one of the brightest spots of the 18th century was the remarkable Hindu-Muslim unity. The two communities lived together harmoniously, with very little communal bitterness or religious intolerance. The syncretic traditions of the Hindu Bhakti movement and Islamic Sufism continue to foster mutual respect. We see incredible examples of cross-religious patronage. The Hindu Marathas actively supported the Sufi shrine of Sheikh Moinuddin Chishti in Ajmer, and the Raja of Tanjore financed the shrine of Sheikh Shahul Hamid. Another powerful example of this unity involves Tipu Sultan. He provided significant financial support to the Sringeri Temple, a major Hindu site dedicated to the goddess Sharadamba, originally founded by the great Vedic scholar Adi Shankaracharya. This cooperation went far beyond just religious donations. It permeated the culture. It was common for Hindu intellectuals to write poetry and administrative texts in Persian, while Muslim writers frequently composed literature in Hindi, Bengali, and other regional vernaculars. When we look at the condition of women during this century, the picture is quite grim. With the notable exception of Kerala, women across India were subjected to almost complete male control. While they were culturally honored, this respect was strictly conditional on them confining themselves entirely to the roles of a mother and a wife. Society allowed them very little individuality or agency of their own. This lack of agency was enforced through several oppressive social evils. The dowry system was widespread, particularly in Bengal and Rajputana, though the Peshwas and Mashrahara tried to curb it. Upper-class families were often ruined by the societal pressure to incur heavy expenses during marriages. The purdah system, which secluded women from public view, was strictly enforced among the higher classes in northern India, though it was largely absent in the south. Additionally, polygamy was accepted for men, whereas women were strictly expected to marry only once in their lifetime. The oppression extended to the end of a woman's life as well. The horrific practice of sati, where a widow immolated herself on her husband's funeral pyre, was prevalent among the royals and upper castes in Rajputana and Bengal, though the Marathas discouraged it and it was rare in the south. If a widow survived, higher caste norms strictly prohibited her from remarrying. Leaders like Raja Sawai Jai Singh tried to promote widow remarriage, but they failed against entrenched traditions. Child marriage was also rampant. Almost all families were strictly patriarchal and patrilineal, with the fascinating exception of the Nair community in Kerala, which followed a matrilineal system. Turning to education, the 18th century system was entirely traditional. The curriculum was heavily confined to literature, law, religion, philosophy, and logic. Crucially, it completely excluded the study of physical and natural sciences, technology, and geography. Despite these curriculum flaws, teachers were highly respected, and surprisingly, the average literacy rate among the population was actually higher during this time than it would be later under British colonial administration. Access to education varied greatly. Elementary education was quite widespread. While dominated by higher castes, many individuals from lower castes also received basic schooling. Unfortunately, girls were almost entirely excluded from education, with only a few exceptions in very wealthy families. Higher education centers were spread across the country, funded by local nawabs and zamindars. For Hindus, higher education was based on Sanskrit and restricted mostly to Brahmins. Meanwhile, Persian education was highly sought after by both Hindus and Muslims, as it remained the official language of administration and courtly life. Culturally, 18th century India was showing signs of exhaustion. Traditionally, the royal courts, nobles, and zamindars financed the arts. As these groups became impoverished due to political instability, cultural activities were gradually neglected, leading to a rapid decline in monumental art and architecture. However, we shouldn't view this as a complete dark age. Instead of disappearing, many talented painters and architects simply migrated away from Delhi to emerging provincial courts, finding new patronage in vibrant cities like Hyderabad, Lucknow, Kashmir, and Patna. Music, in particular, proved highly resilient, continuing to develop and flourish across both North and South India. In the north, significant musical progress was made under the reign of Emperor Muhammad Shah. Down south, the Tanjore court became a massive patron of music, poetry, and dance. This era also produced powerful regional voices, like Tayammanavar, a brilliant Tamil sitar poet whose works boldly protested the abuses of temple authorities and the rigid caste system. Literature also saw incredible regional diversification. Urdu spread rapidly, becoming the medium of social interaction for the upper classes in North India and sparking a golden age of Urdu poetry. Regional vernaculars thrived under local patronage. Malayalam literature was revived by the Travancore rulers, and Assamese literature flourished under the Ahom kings. In Gujarat, the great lyricist Dayaram was active. In Punjab, Wardas Shah composed the immortal romantic epic Heer Ranja, while in Sindh, Shah Abdul Latif wrote his famous collection of poems, the Risalo. Kerala deserves a special mention for its cultural output during this century. It witnessed the full, mature development of Kathakali, a spectacular synthesis of literature, drama, and dance that remains iconic today. Additionally, the magnificent Padmanabhanpuram Palace was constructed during this time, leaving a lasting legacy of remarkable wooden architecture and breathtaking mural paintings. But this brings us to the most critical, fatal weakness of 18th century Indian society, the scientific lag. While Western Europe was experiencing a massive scientific and economic revolution, India remained stubbornly tied to tradition and superstition. Despite a glorious ancient history of mathematics and natural sciences, Indians had neglected these fields for centuries. The ruling classes, with the rare exception of leaders like Tipu Sultan, were completely ignorant of the scientific and technological achievements happening in the West. Ultimately, this profound weakness in science and technology is what allowed a highly advanced British force to totally subjugate the Indian subcontinent. To wrap up our lecture, let's summarize the dual nature of 18th century India. Economically, it was a landscape of backward agriculture and declining trade, yet it maintained a resilient world-class manufacturing base that drew in global wealth. Socially and culturally, it was a society deeply fractured by caste, burdened by oppressive social evils, and culturally stagnant at the imperial center, even as regional arts flourished. Most importantly, its failure to embrace scientific advancement left it vulnerable, setting the stage for the dawn of British colonial rule. Thank you for joining this detailed exploration of a pivotal century in Indian history.